I love the voice. Recording in progress. Recording in progress. It's
It
quite
doesn't, yeah, it doesn't
she's
know how to,
quite firm about it.
but it doesn't know how to say it, which is
Re-
interesting.
yeah. Recording in progress. Hey,
Yes.
see, much nicer.
See,
Recording in progress.
Zoom needs to hire you to speak it.
I'm very, if any, or what's it, voice acting agencies want to hire me, very welcome to.
Yeah, perfect
We do
candidate.
do that thing. I do a show on Radio 4, and I do it with a guy called Sean Keaveney, who's got a wonderful voice. It's very calming, it's very soothing voice. And in order, they always get you to warm up your mics at the BBC beforehand, tell you. And we just basically out ASMR each other. So like, you're listening to BBC Radio 4, that sort of thing. And he does it too. And the producers get all tingly, which is probably a bit too much information, really, but never mind.
Hell, those producers, they get all tingly and weird all the time.
Well, yeah, they are weird, bless them. But they're good. I like them.
Bless the
They
bunch of
give me
weirdos.
work.
Hey,
Yeah.
it's fun being weird. You should try it sometime. One of my
Well,
co-writers, former
I
co-writers,
mean,
say that.
some of us don't need to wear a hat to be weird. So just saying.
Just saying. And speaking of archaeology, we're going to talk about some suffragettes today.
Exactly, it's ancient past. Really, you got to dig around a lot. A huge advantage of suffragettes is they were so reported because they were so interesting. So it's very easy to find who was involved and all of the people and why. The news reporting is interesting and fun because it goes from very, very upset about these poor women to these are demons, which is a really nice sort of change in attitudes as they got more and more violent. What was happening in the UK was throughout the late 19th century, there were lots of women who wanted, obviously, the right to vote. I mean, it's so bizarre, and a movement sort of kept growing. And by the turn of the century, so by sort of 1903, 1904, that sort of time, um, enough women were getting so frustrated to the point that they were not getting listened to that they decided to take a more militant action, and they weren't going to sort of like try and please the men and be very reasonable anymore because they noticed that men don't really respond to reason, they respond to violence, and they respond to much more aggressive protest. And this is where you get to see, to begin with, it was more sort of like marching and organizing mass, huge events, in Hyde Park, where, you couldn't see the grass. There's so many women, so many signs, all done incredibly it was incredibly organized. So these women were marching like like men. You never see this. There were women playing brass instruments. I mean, this is they're coming from all over the country down to London to do these huge protests, and the politicians said, "Oh, that's nice," and ignored them.
It's
It
quite
it was
fun.
it was like you hadn't seen anything. I think the largest, this might be completely wrong, but I seem to recall reading somewhere that there was a massive protest, I think in 1908 or 1909 in Hyde Park, and that was the largest gathering in Hyde Park since the Great Exhibition in like the 1856, which was organised Prince Albert and Queen Victoria as a sort of mass, big celebration of empire. And this was just pretty much, there were men, obviously, men were suffragists as well, but this was just a mass organization of women going, now this is silly, you've got to give us the right to vote. You've given, and this is before as well, there's certain restrictions to vote in the UK. So you had to have, for a long time, you had to have property if you're a man in order to be able to vote. You had to have an official address and that sort of thing. You had to be of an educational standard. But there was a woman who managed to get into Parliament or have a vote in Parliament because her husband had died, and she was a widow, but she was in charge of the estate. And so all of these rules. And when you have women, like you had women doctors who were sort of getting into universities and getting through it, but the moment they were allowed in, the moment that happened, the rules were quickly changed so no more women could follow them. And that was basically how it was with voting. And you have very sensible, this is a hugely upwardly mobile time. I mean, the British Empire was never bigger. They were never richer. And there's this huge like clamoring for representation. And women had representation at a local level. So in local councils they could, and they were sort of proving that they were as good as men, on school boards, everything else. They were having all of this, much more power. And yet, at the very center of government, there was nothing which could represent them. And there were issues which really mattered to women, which, the men just weren't debating or weren't completely overlooking. So the frustration was real, was there, and the women wanted to do something about it. And they weren't asking for a lot. They weren't asking for a vote for every woman, even. They were asking a vote for rich women with land and property, or even, there's a huge issue because they were promised in 1910, they were promised that rich women might be able to vote. So we're only talking sort of, about 30,000 people extra. And at this point, the government pulled it rug from under them. So in 1909, they'd planned all these protests, and then they said, "Oh no, we've got this bill coming, we've got this bill coming," and they just got rid of it, mainly because there was an election coming up, and Asquith was a coward. But yeah, they pulled it away from them, and they got really frustrated, which started the Black Friday riots, and it started all of these. It started a much more militant form of protest, really. And it was
And this
because they kept getting promised, and the promises vanished before them.
in a country that had a queen since 600.
Well, at this point, it was the king. It was the king at this point. So,
Okay. Oh yeah, that's
but
right.
yeah,
The
so
queen
so
the queen didn't matter anymore. It was all the king.
Queen was dead. But yeah, and also, the thing with Queen Victoria, she never really ruled that much. She was kind of like, she did. Queen Victoria was such an odd lady because basically she wanted the power, she wanted being power, and she kept getting pregnant. So, because she liked sex, she didn't like kids much, but she liked sex. And Prince Albert was effectively running the country for a lot of, well, having the influence of running the country. Parliament was still in charge, obviously, but he had huge political power. And she would get very, very frustrated with him, as often shouting at him to let her try and, he'd just walk out the room because the big fear with the royal family at the time was that she'd be like her uncle. Her uncle was Mad King George. So this was, the fear that there's this sort of madness running through the royalty. And so every time she raised her voice, everybody just left her alone. And so she was completely powerless. And then when he died, she went a bit potty because she obviously loved him. And then basically moved to Scotland, and nobody ever saw her. And she was like the opposite of Queen Elizabeth, because Queen Elizabeth would be in, like, you'd just see pictures of her, never know her opinions on anything. And Queen Victoria, you'd never see her, but she'd write to the papers each week saying how upset she was with everything and how everybody was an idiot. So it's like the complete flipped version. Um, but yeah, I mean, the British Empire at this point, admittedly, we'd lost a few colonies, but it was huge. I think it didn't reach its peak until after the First World War, but just before the First World War, it was massive, and London was a huge centre of power. So the WSPU, which is the Women's Social Political Union, started in Manchester, which is this huge economic, like, it's a powerhouse of factories. Basically it was a cotton making, machine. And it's also, it was connected to Liverpool, which was steel making and docks and all the rest of it. So it was just money. And you had all of these affluent women who suddenly realized that they had absolutely no rights at all and thought this is absolutely terrible. So these women who would, in the past, would never have been educated, they might have been, suddenly, like Emily Pankhurst being and her sisters being the fine example of this, just completely outraged that all of these idiot men were, running around doing, making huge errors, and they're not seeing reason, not being rational, and they wanted to say, because why not? And they sort of started it up there, and they actually got working class women involved. They never promised working class women the vote. It's just one of these sort of like, what? So you have like absolute heroes like Annie Kenney, who had been working in a factory floor in Manchester since she was a child. She missed fingers because she'd been working in the looms, and she was fighting, I mean, literally fighting, for the
So rich
right
women can
for
vote.
posh, yes, for rich women to just be seen as vaguely capable. I think ultimately they all wanted everybody to have the vote, but they didn't. You have to make concessions and you have to be very reasonable. They were reasonable in that sense, just not when they were like blowing up post boxes and things like that. I mean, this was a huge thing, and it wasn't only a class issue; it was also a race issue. I mean, Sophia Julep Singh was she was the what was her official? She was the goddaughter of Queen. Victoria. So she, she had she was living, I think, in Hampton Court Palace, one of the apartments there. And oh, I've dropped your, hang on, sorry. You can edit that out if you wish, but I think it's nice to, have my earphones fall out for you. But Sophia Julep-Singh was the goddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she'd been brought up in sort of like Thetford in Norfolk, sort of lovely country estate, and her basically father got absolutely ripped off by Britain, had his entire, any political power in his home country completely ripped away from him. He was from India. It was bad, including lovely diamonds, which are still, anyway, it doesn't matter. The point being that she was becoming very politically aware of the treatment of Indians and the treatment of other colonies in the empire, and was hugely, felt hugely, motivated to try and right these wrongs as well. But the way that she got to do that was actually through the feminism of the political movement. She thought women are much more reasonable than men. They're not going to allow other women to be starving in order that, some men can make a few more money. So she was very into trying to get women to vote because she saw them as more reasonable and rational about caring for people. Which I think she's probably right, however, not right enough in that. But so there's this huge drive, all of these different political, because the thing about London in like 1900 to 1910 sort of time, it was very different to possibly how you think of it. We sort of think of it as, like, I always think of it like the Titanic, because it's when the Titanic was being built in, and it's those sort of costumes, it's very refined and that sort of thing. But London was full of gangsters. It was full of terrorist attacks. Somebody tried to blow up the Royal Observatory. There's gangs of Russians, there's gangs of anarchists, there's gangs all around. There's street fights, where police are battering down. Nowadays London and police officers don't own firearms, and back then there was when was it? I think it was 1911, or maybe it was 1910. It was the winter of 1910, the Sydney Street massacre, where the police just went into this house to beat up some well, not beat up, to try and arrest some basically some gangsters, some thieves. And there's a massive shootout, and several police officers died, I think, from the city police. And yeah, it was a very dangerous, violent time with a lot of political upheavals. At the same time as the suffragettes, you had school children demanding rights, going on protest. A school, like whole schools of children protesting, doing sit-in protests and that sort of thing in 1912, and that sort of thing, to try and get, stop the corporal punishment, try and get some reasonable teaching out. All of this was happening, and it was the sort of opportunity of actually saying, actually, these things might be possible. We can change something. But the Women's Social and Political Union, which was a sort of branch of the suffragettes, really sort of took things on a whole new level. And the government had to change their policies in order to deal with these unruly women.
So how did it all, like, what was the moment that kicked off
I
the
think when
protest?
things got really nasty, there's a few incidents, and I think I would say there's a few incidents before this where you do have the separation. You have the suffragists going one direction, the suffragettes going in the other. The suffragettes are the mad ones, right? And there's a few different political points, there's a few in discussions, that sort of thing. But Black Friday in 1910 was a big one. And what happened was the consolidation bill, which was, the conciliation bill, which was this idea that some women were going to be given the vote, married rich women, was retracted. And so the suffragettes think, well, we've agreed with the government that we won't do any protests because this bill's coming up. They've retracted it. We're going to have a mass protest. And they did this in 1910. And it was in November. And what happened was they just had a load of petitions and were going to march into Parliament with them. Now, at the time, they just started this thing where when they were being arrested normally, so say they went to a local council and they sort of got up and shouted, they'd be, taken away. And if they continued to be a bother, if they spat in policemen's faces, like Annie Kenney did, well done her, they would be arrested for that and put in prison. And when they were put in prison, they would write political notes to all of the letters to all of the newspapers, and the newspapers loved it because it was a great story, and so they printed it. So this is before there was Twitter, this is before there's any social media, and so this was the way they were getting their word out, and other women were reading about this, going, "These women are being locked up, and they didn't actually do anything wrong. They just want to be treated like that." I don't think that that's that bad. And that there's this huge outrage at the government because of it. And so in 1910, we had a Home Secretary. You might have heard of him. He's called Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill was at this point a baddie, because he basically thought, well, the women are being arrested and we're putting them in prison, and in prison they're embarrassing us and they're writing to the press, and the press are taking their side. And this is making the government look bad. So what I'll do is I'll tell the police, don't arrest them, but also don't let them into Parliament, obviously, but you're not allowed to arrest them. Now, imagine you're a police officer, okay? You've got women moving forwards towards you. They're not going to stop at all. What do you do to stop them? The only thing you can do to stop them is to whack them. And that is kind of what the police force was like anyway. There was a sort of rule with the Metropolitan Police back then where I think you had to be ex-army, you had to be over 6 foot, and you have really one job, which is to basically be meat and muscle and do what you're told. And so these, police officers were throwing the women out. Like, there's women, Miss Billinghurst was thrown out of her wheelchair. There's all of this thing happening. Women got seriously injured. One woman broke her leg, and a death has been contributed to this riot. It lasted for hours, and women were sexually assaulted because the police officer just shoved them into the crowd where they were, in the crowd were loads of men jeering at them because you had, anti-suffragette, movement as well. So there's loads of men just taking advantage of the women that had been, hit on the head and everything else. So all of that was happening. It was pretty horrific. In the end, the police did arrest them because they couldn't stop them because these women were just walking into batons. There was the wonderful scene of a police officers going around whacking, some women as well. It's just, there's a police officer R21 who actually put in my kid's book who was witnessed sort of basically assaulting them. And it was, and the photos made the press. And you have women, and you can still see these photos. You have women lying on the floor, clutching their faces. You have police officers raising their batons, pulling, dragging women away. And they're twice their size. And you
Yeah.
have women trying to fight back, which is absolutely, from a woman's perspective, when you can actually see what's going on. And these women are, so brave and so stupid in so many ways because,
Yeah.
a lot of them did get injured. Anyway, they were all arrested and later charged with things. But that was sort of like the big sort of, okay, we're not gonna pussyfoot about this. We're going to go straight into and take this on. And so after that is when you really get the starvation tactics in prisons. So instead of just writing off, you have women refusing food. And when women refuse food, the government go, I don't know what to do with this because, this is a big deal. We're in their care. If they die under our watch, it's going to look really bad. And a few women did die. They didn't die in the prison. They were let go because they were getting so ill. They're being force-fed as well. And it's wonderful, the difference in class with being force-fed. So you have pictures of Emmeline Pankhurst when she's been arrested and she's being force-fed, and this spoon is really close to her lips. It's like so close to her lips, and she's like, no, I won't. She was from Manchester, so she didn't sound like that. But, she was like, whereas working class women, so you
Yeah.
get put in a chair, strapped down, a hose is fed either through your mouth or through your nose, and, a gruel is put down there.
Yeah.
And, apparently the whole situation, of having a tube and being force fed in that way is really painful and really horrible. But the worst thing about it, if you read all the witness accounts, is they just whip it straight out of you. So they pull the rubber tube straight out of your nose and it hits everything else and you vomit slightly and blood, and it's just absolutely awful.
Or you
And so this was
throw up
happening, and of
everything,
course,
yeah.
yeah, no, it's just ugh. So they were doing this, and the government realized that, some women were coming out and dying. There were women dying in 1910 from this, so it was bad. And so what the government did was they said, right, in 1913, I think 1913, it's the Cat and Mouse Act. So what we're going to do is, if they're really sick, we're going to let them go. so they can feed back up, and then we'll rearrest them when they're a bit healthier, and then they can carry out their sentence. So it's like, a cat playing with a mouse, so like catching it, hurting it, and then letting it go for a bit, and then catching
Okay.
it again and letting it go a bit.
So they wanted whose idea wait, who thought this was a good idea? Like, okay, we don't want them to
Oh,
die, so we're gonna let them go home, get healthy, and then we're gonna arrest them?
yeah, that was the idea. I don't know whose idea it was directly, but Churchill signed off on it. I mean, Churchill was mad in this time period. I mean, he really was. He wanted, like, there was protests, there's strikers in Liverpool. I think slightly later, maybe 16 or 17.
How the
Um,
fuck did
who
this guy lead your country in World War II?
Because he was insane and he was very useful for about 6 months, and every other part of his life he was absolutely mad. I mean, great writer, don't get me wrong, love his stuff. Utterly mad. Just complete,
Like,
you know.
this is
Just
this is something I would have never had imagined actually happened.
But no, he tried to. There were strikers in Liverpool. He wanted to send gunboats up the Mersey. He wanted, like the river there, he wanted to shoot and destroy the Liverpool docks just to stop these men from protesting. He would bomb areas of, like, the Middle East, to give, them a lively terror, just to show them who was boss. He was not a nice man. Really not. I mean, don't get me wrong, for Churchill fans, absolutely love his writing. It's great. It's very, very him. And like I say, without him, the Second World War would have been entirely different, and Europe would have looked completely different. And don't get me wrong, I'm not dissing the guy for that, but oh my goodness, I don't think I would have voted for him ever.
With
Really
these
not.
with these domestic situations, he's just using military tactics because it's like,
Yeah,
hey, let's just use violence to scare people. Shut off some
I mean,
bombs.
there was a real sort of like, because this is, you've got eugenics movements and things like that. There's this real sort of distaste for poverty. It's their fault still, and there's a big movement. The thing that really changes with the way that people start this sort of thing of, actually we need to look after ourselves, and actually this is really important, is the Boer War. So it's the Second Boer War at the end of the 19th century. Britain needs an army to send down to South Africa because we accidentally, basically, we took over South Africa and rid it of slavery because we're so nice like that. We're still treating the African population absolutely terribly, but they're not slaves anymore. We got rid of those horrible Dutch Boers, and the Dutch Boers had just travelled north to the Transvaal, and in the Transvaal, we discovered that they discovered diamonds and gold. And so, this was then, this is Johannesburg. This is like, and so we said, oh, actually, we kind of want those. And so we went to get them on the pretext of we were going to free people, and stuff like that, and dodgy
Because
reasoning.
that would make up
And when
for
we
it.
I mean, this is where British really sort of like put the concentration camp into great use. It's one really shady part of our history where we locked up, Dutch Boer women and basically starved them to death because it's so lovely. Anyway, but the point is that when we wanted that army, we found that the average man was undernourished, incredibly ill, and we just didn't. We worried that we didn't actually have an army to actually send anymore because industrialization, cramped living conditions, no health service, bad food, all of this had just depleted the population of men. And that is when you get to see things like, oh, actually, maybe we should feed the children, so we'll give them school meals, free ones to kids, just to keep them a bit fatter. Maybe we should actually start to invest more in, like, making sure that people are paid enough that they can actually feed themselves. That might actually help our own defense. And this all sort of like was starting to sort of be talked about more and taken more seriously by the men in charge, because they didn't see it as a sort of like a wishy-washy, looking after the welfare and people. They should look after themselves and God will do all that. It became a sort of, oh, we need actually to feed people because at the moment they're starving and this is bad. And it was also ridiculous, the wealth inequality and everything else. The fact, that you had people who couldn't afford, a room. I mean, in the middle of the 18th century, 18th century, 19th century, you had people, who were living in pigsties in central Manchester. You had women who, and men, obviously, who basically coupled up for the night to keep warm. This wasn't prostitution. This was, we don't have shoes. It is -2 degrees or Celsius, which I don't know how much that is in Fahrenheit, cold. below freezing point, and the only way we're going to survive the night is if we sort of get in bed together. And by bed, a pigsty under a bridge. And we're going to work tomorrow. We're fully employed. Yay. So that's the sort of level of, deprivation and poverty that was happening. And there was a growing movement of like people looking after things like sewage and stop big diseases. And really, though, that's all to do with, the embankments and everything else, Bazalgette and all of that. It's to do with stopping it stinking because the rich people had to live in London too. So it's but so, you can see the sort of motivations for women who really are more responsible for childcare, more responsible for looking after people, and also intelligent middle class women, heavily involved in the church, heavily involved in community projects, and
And
wanting to
I know
improve
what the
things.
obvious answer might be for this,
Mm.
but so when we step half an inch back to people coupled up for the night to stay warm, um,
Mm-hmm.
so women were also getting shafted too at this time.
Oh yeah, but there's no. I mean, if you're poor and a woman, there's really nothing worse. But at this time, because of there's things happening, which is as the British Empire. So, I mean, that was I'm Karl Marx's friend, whose name's just escaped me. It's Condition of the Working Class, and his name's like, it's just gone. But it's a wonderful book. Just read it. It's incredible. Um, but he basically just charts, these, children think that Jesus Christ is the King of England and don't really understand who God is. It's all of this sort of horror at their lack of understanding of theology, as well as the fact that they can't read or eat or know anything about the way the country is run. They're just surviving. And so there's a sort of like moral panic that's happening. At the same time, there's an actual panic because we don't have any healthy men to feed to keep our army going, and we've got the biggest empire that's ever existed. This
And
is
on
important.
yeah, and on
Yeah,
top of
sorry.
that, because children are starving and grew up with a mom that had them because they coupled for a night to stay warm, and clearly the government and the rich don't really care about them. They're also going into gangs and life of crime.
Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist is pretty historically accurate, as well as being incredibly anti-Semitic. But it is, an accurate, representation of what Dickens was seeing, which is gangs of children who'd been abandoned by their parents who can afford them and didn't want them, and they would go and join little street gangs and just, survive the way they could. And if they were caught, they're either deported or they were, locked up. They're usually deported, to be fair. So that's where we're sending people off to Australia and everything else. It's great. It's really not great. But
So this is
it's
really creating an interesting, this is creating a whole different image on the suffrage movement then.
well, I think it's a big driving force is the idea that, it isn't like women are looking at the world and thinking, well, men have done a really good job and let's try and get involved. They're thinking we can see issues which aren't getting addressed because Parliament is running the blooming planet at this point. They're deciding things that are happening in Canada, in Australia, in India. They're not focused on the stuff at home. And I think women were feeling like, come on, pay attention. We need the power to be able to solve some of these real issues. And they are, moral as they are, and also there's this idea because, you do have movements like you have this great Methodist movement in the 18th century, because the big problem is really from the 18th century onwards, there's a huge problem with things like gin and alcohol. I mean, you think British people drink a lot now. Oh, it's nothing. And the reason is the only public social space you can go to is a pub. So you go to, if you were cold, you go to the public house, you get yourself an ale, you'd sit down. Also, no fresh water. Chadwick was putting in lovely pumps and that sort of thing, but chances are you'd get some sort of terrible disease from it. Can't afford tea because you can't afford a fire. You go to a pub, you spend your time in the pub, you rent a room, you sleep on the floor with 18 other people you've never met before. They even had a rope. So like, for the night, you could buy a rope and this rope would hang a bit like a just literally a rope, and you'd just hang off it, so you just slump over the top of it and try and fall asleep standing up like that, and that cost a penny, and that's where you slept. There all of these homeless people who had a place to sleep because they'd rent for the night and then have to move on. It was poverty like you couldn't imagine. It really was. Which is why you get people sent to Australia for stealing a handkerchief. It was anyway. But it was all starting to change by the end of the 19th century, where you had this sort of moral focus sort of come in as you had a bigger middle class who were, profiting off the empire like crazy and profiting off the suffering of other people. But, they were starting to look around and see this inequality and try and fix it. And you had all of these educated women because you could afford to educate your daughter, so you did. And then they learnt about all of these sort of wonderful philosophers, which inspired terrible things like America. But you learn about this idea of like freedom and all of this sort of stuff. And then you look around and you see what's happening, and you get involved with the church, but you're so limited in where you can go with the church, and you get involved with local politics, but you're so limited. And these are clever people. They want to change the world and they can't because of their sex. And so as a result, the suffrage movement in all its forms started to grow like crazy, particularly as it's very hard to deny that women aren't capable of thought and thinking. And I don't think, I sort of write about this in the kids, but I really don't think that men genuinely thought women were that stupid. I still don't think they think that. I think that at the time, particularly with men like Churchill, he was thinking, oh, women want the vote. I got power because men voted for me. I don't know what's going to happen if women don't vote for me. Well, I know what's going to happen if they don't vote. I don't know if they will. So why change anything? Once you're in power, it's very difficult to change anything. And I think it was more that fear than a fear of, well, women will just vote for pretty kittens rather than anything good. And I think it was the fear of political upset, not the sexism of, well, women are very stupid and can't think. There were people who thought like that, still are people who think like that, but I think the majority of men in power understood that women were not complete morons and probably deserved the vote. They were just fearful of what would happen to their own position if they gave it to them.
So did that well, I mean, so there was people that did think that, but did the whole shift in media to where it's like, oh well, um, let's try and discredit them. Is that where maybe the popular idea that women can't vote rationally, they're going to vote for kittens and
I think that was way before, because you have this sort of terrible thing in Victorian Britain of the stereotypes really get enforced, and it's a big sort of like, because there's a certain way to be civilized. That's how you be civilized. In order to be civilized, it's very sort of, the woman's very polite and calm and quiet, and the man takes charge. And it's that I think we seek safety in that sort of nuclear family stereotypical idea. And so a beautiful woman, and it's not just, it's down to things like disease. Tuberculosis was massive at the time. It still is a huge issue globally. But they called it consumption then because they thought it was something that you were born with. Consumption is a very elegant disease. What it did was it made all men geniuses because it made them brilliant writers, and it made them sort of like, terribly sad because they're all anemic from part of the infection. And women, of course, it made very sallow skinned, very thin, very pale, very delicate. And it's still our current fashion for women to be very, very small and very, very thin with like big sort of gaunt, that look is tuberculosis, is what somebody with TB looks like. And as a result, this idea of women being very petite, and it's also a sign of wealth because it's a sign of, I've never had to work. I don't have to work in a factory. I'm just so wan and thin and like, delicate. I need protection. And all of that, it's a sort of, it's been bred by the environment as to what people sort of see as, whereas your average working girl got to TB, died too quickly to be sexy. So it's these middle class girls with their deep interests and the big pale eyes, looking a bit like, a Tim Burton character, that's the that's the sort of desired thing. It was seen as very glamorous because the Victorians were obsessed with death. Their funerals were immense. They were just so, everything's about, grandiosity and sort of, Victoria wore black for the rest of her life after Albert died. It was hugely, fetishized. And sex was completely sort of seen as, never talk about sex, always talk about death. It's like the opposite of now, even.
never talk about death, always talk about sex. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well, that's what we do. I mean, that's kind of our
Yeah.
culture is very, very, we deny the existence of death almost. Whereas
Yeah.
back then, death all the time, baby. It's amazing. And sex didn't happen.
Sex wasn't real and death
Yeah.
was.
But all of that happened before, the suffragette movement got violent. And I think it was the triggering point of it was, for me, loads of, better historians, I'm a generalist, loads of better historians will say, well, actually, there's a really important meeting that happened on the 6th of like June in like 1906 or something like that. And fair enough, fair enough. But for me, I think Black Friday was a huge turning point. And it was also because the Cat and Mouse Act then got introduced, it meant that for the first time, suffragettes didn't want to be arrested anymore. Because if you were arrested, it was basically a death sentence. And it wasn't a way to pray. Like previously, when you'd gone to prison, you were given pins. They made badges and pins for you to like medals to show that you'd supported the movement. It was like a big deal going to, you know, being put in prison because you'd been arrested at a protest. It was seen as a great thing to do for the cause. It's a sort of sacrifice. You became a sort of martyr. But after that, it became important that women don't get arrested actually because they will, you know, and there was huge, like, you know, and Emmeline Pankhurst had so many like arrest warrants out for her. It was very difficult to stop her being arrested. I mean, Sylvia, they escaped to France for a few times. They had to go abroad to try and not be arrested. And part of the way that they weren't arrested was that they had a bodyguard. And it's this woman, Edith Garrard, who I found out about through my friend Naomi Paxton, who's a historian on the suffragist movement. She and just general theatre in early in early 20th century Britain. She told me about this woman who was 4'10". Her husband was into, you know, physical exertion and was a fitness instructor and that sort of thing. And she went to a dojo with Edward Barton Wright, who you would have heard of him because you've heard of Sherlock Holmes, right?
Yep.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes, fictional character, obviously. But he does a particular martial art called Bartitsu. And Bartitsu is Edward Barton Wright's particular style of self-defense, which is if you're a gentleman, you have a cape, you have a hat, you have a cane. We're going to use this in our self-defense. So he studied all sorts of martial arts. He'd been to Japan, he'd done everything else. And he learnt, you know, jiu-jitsu, judo, I think Schwingen as well from Germany. He was a big like he was into his martial arts, and he came up with his own called Bartitsu, using a gentleman in the country, you know, what you have around you. And Edith Garrard, who was, you know, knew him, was 4'10", tiny, couldn't really put any of his stuff into practice because she wasn't a gentleman. She didn't have a cane. She had an umbrella though, and she had like sharp pointy shoes, and she was quite small, so she could fit under people better. And wrist locks seemed to work quite well. And she could actually, you know, on her body, if she had pockets in her skirt, she could actually fit whole Indian clubs. And she worked out her own sort of method of jujitsu using, you know, the female body as opposed to the male body. And she taught female suffragettes in the Golden Square Dojo how to do self-defense and how to avoid, you know, not only arrest, but also avoid getting hurt, you know, being able to fall over without breaking, you know, your wrists and your arms and that sort of thing, being able to rough it up a bit. And this resulted in you had this bodyguard who would travel and shadow Emmeline Pankhurst and all the other leaders whenever they were going. So my favourite story is one where they go up to Glasgow, and I think it's 1914, and Emmeline Pankhurst, you know, if the police see her, they're going to arrest her. And she's due to speak at this massive auditorium, effectively. And the police are there. And they're looking out for her, going to arrest her. And they know she's going to speak on the stage. No sign of her. They're checking, like, there's all these sort of stories about, you know, women being sneaked into theatres in, like, you know, trunks and that sort of thing. So they're checking all the trunks and everything else. And Emmeline Pankhurst buys a ticket for her own show and walks in with the crowd, and they don't notice her. So it's about to start. She gets up out of the audience, goes up to the lectern. The moment she goes up to the lectern, the police realise what's happening, and they start to storm the stage. At which point, 16 women get up with their Indian clubs, with their, you know, abilities. She doesn't get arrested for 8 minutes. And I want you to think about that. How long are, you know, your average boxing match is? I mean, the police don't not have guns. They've got truncheons, and the women have Indian clubs. And it takes the police 8 minutes to arrest her. And she's arrested on the stage, so she doesn't move. Think about that. Think about how long a John Wick action sequence is, what goes on there, how quickly a grown man should be able to just plow through women who are not strong. And I'm thinking that these women are incredibly skilled. I mean, I couldn't last that long. I'd last about 30 seconds. And I do jujitsu. I know stuff, you know, but one good punch to the head, then you're done.
Yeah,
And
you're
there
done.
were men who, from that, I mean, there is this wonderful thing, of course, that even, like police officers are humans. They do not want to hit women. There is that instinct in them.
Yeah.
So I presume that sort of like might, but once they've had their knee kicked, and there's a couple of police officers who don't return, nobody dies, but they don't return to duty. So they were injured enough that they can't continue to. I mean, and of course, all those women were arrested and treated very badly. However, the point is that this bodyguard was incredibly, actually, they knew what they were doing. And obviously not enough to overpower anybody and completely put an end to, but I find that incredible. That, and also that these are middle class women, a lot of them, and they're just sacrificing everything for this sort of like right to vote.
Yeah. And
It's
this isn't
just
like,
mad.
too, I mean, to help put it in picture, I mean, when you look at anything on TV,
Mm.
even though it's stretched out over the course of like 45 minutes, it's really like a 10-minute fight.
Yeah.
And that's because it's heavily regulated, super regulated. There's certain ways you can grapple somebody, or certain places you can't hit somebody. And so for 8 minutes, 8 whole minutes, they're
I mean,
capable.
okay, let's say that the witnesses who saw it exaggerated. Say it's 4 minutes. Still, I mean,
Yeah, four
anything
minutes is
longer than
impressive.
anything longer than 2 minutes is insane. Just, I mean, I don't know how many police officers were there and actually doing it. They didn't, they counted the ones that got hit, but they didn't say how many were there total. But still, I mean, it's just incredible to me. And
Because you're down in
the thing
three
is,
hits. You're
yeah, I
down
mean,
in three hits at the most in a real
I mean,
fight.
one good punch to the solar plexus, you're down. One good shot to the liver. One good hit to the head. And police officers have helmets. Suffragettes don't. It's just, anyway. So the point is though that it wasn't just the bodyguard. There were other protest forms. I mean, obviously, there whole other sections were far more women in other parts of the country. They were doing things to raise money, which was absolutely beautiful. So they would do things like they had roller skating. They had roller skating all night to sort of protest the census being taken, that they refused to put their names on the census and all of this sort of thing. Emily Wilding Davidson is the sort of the big uh uh the big sort of character there, because she's you might have seen as an American that one of the protesters got hit by the King's horse at the Derby. Do you know of that story? So that the
I've
big
only heard
race.
I've only heard that there was the king, like there's a famous King's horse incident, but I don't know anything else about.
Basically, Emily Wilding Davison protesting. This is was they're filming this. This is how this is filming. I think, when was it? It must have been, oh gosh, 19. I hang on, let me think. It must have been, no, couldn't have been 1912. It must have been 1913. So that's when I think she dies, in because it happens in June, that race. Anyway, the point is, racing event, King's there. King's horse, very important horse, obviously. No, a favourite, but not necessarily going to win it. They're into their racing, the royal family. And yeah, and she just walks out in front of the horses as a protest, and she gets trampled to death in front of everyone, and it's filmed, so you can see it. And so of course she goes down a hero. But before then, she during the 1911 census, which is obviously the count, she spent the census in a cupboard in Parliament. That's where she hid, in order to sort of point out that women, because loads of women didn't put their names down in the 1911 census, which is really annoying if you're a historical fiction author and want to know where they lived. What I'm doing at the time. But yeah, and she was like, but when she was arrested, she tried to kill herself in prison several times. I found that out I was reading some of her court documents, and I found, like, oh really? So she was quite, mad. Anyway, and very into sacrificing herself and becoming a martyr, which she did achieve. So I'm just like, is she really a hero so much as somebody who might just be a bit mentally ill and unwell? Because I don't particularly agree with suicide as a form of protest, but that's my own opinion. And for other people, she's a hero. But the point is, at this time as well, the women started to bomb places, and they were they did mass protests. So they would do a thing where when Ben struck 5 p.m., they would all get out hammers and smash every shop window they could at the same time, just down the streets of London, and then flee from the police. And because there were so many of them, not everybody could be arrested. And this was one way that they did their mass protest. But these were private businesses who might have been pro-suffragettes. There was one, I've read a letter by this poor woman who had a business. She had a tea shop in one of the parks. I think it was Green Park, but she had a tea shop and the suffragettes burnt it down. So she wrote to them going, "This is a female-run business, guys. I support you guys. Please don't burn my business down." And 6 months later, they did it again. So, they weren't, and they would, burn down, people's homes. They targeted politicians' houses. They targeted golf courses and things like that politicians were on. They poisoned lawns. They would get phosphorus and they put it in because it's covered with a sort of jelly that gradually goes down, and then once it is exposed to air, it sets light. And they would, put these in envelopes and post them in post boxes, so all of the post would be burnt.
Yeah, but what
This was
but what kicked off this radical idea where
it,
suddenly
I put it down to the retraction of the conciliation bill, simply because the one thing that they'd been working towards, they had been chaining themselves to places, they had been making a fuss, but really when things just got retracted again, because they'd been protesting for about 8-9 years at this point, and they realized nothing was going to change unless they started acting mad and bad. And also I think what helped, weirdly, was Northern Ireland, because I don't know if you know anything about the British history with Ireland. We're not great to them either, seriously. If you want to, when Americans put the British as the bad people in every single film, there's a reason for that. Not good people. The Second World War does a lot of heavy lifting for us, it really does. But in Ireland, you have what would eventually become the IRA starting to sort of make themselves known. And the women notice how seriously Parliament takes men protesting in Ireland for a similar representation issue, so much more seriously than women at home doing the same thing. And they see the difference. And the difference is the Irish men are prepared to be violent and they're taken seriously. And that's also what really helps spark it off. I mean, Sylvia Pankhurst is very open about this. She sort of says, look at the men in Ireland. Come on, let's, they're not going to take us seriously until we see some real damage. And I think she's probably right. Now, what happens, of course, is that I don't know if you've heard of this thing called World War One, but that starts. And so everything is sort of put on, pause for that. And the WSPU, everything goes into the war effort, the protests stop in that sort of sense. But also women are given more work during the First World War. They're started to be treated more like men. And then by the end of the First World War, because men before it had been given, like working class men had been given the right to vote, they decided to open that up to women too. So by I think it was 1919, she says, gosh, I should know these dates, women were given the right to vote. And this was expanded out so that by the 1920s, it was, a uniform thing. But it was, the only way that the government were taking them seriously, it seems to me, is when they became a real threat. And when you are burning down politicians' homes, it becomes more of a threat.
okay. Yeah, makes
Yeah.
complete sense. The IRA, baby.
Well, exactly. I mean, they were not the IRA then. The IRA didn't come about for a long time. But I refuse to I refuse to talk about the Irish history because I get muddled very easily with the different names because everything changes. But everybody knows who the IRA is, so it's basically an early form of that. Quite justified if you have a look at the history. Quite justified, in my opinion. Anyway, but yeah, I mean
I mean,
it's such a mad
they're
time.
only coming out of like 1 or 200 years of many genocidal acts. So
It's just, yeah, the whole potato famine is not, it's it's ridiculous how
yeah.
easy we could
So
have
was
helped.
there like at this time too? There was culturally between the classes, between the upper income bracket and that lower income bracket. This funny enough, this minority that owned all the money and power, and then there was this majority that had no money and no power. There's this like there's this colossal disconnect.
Yeah. But I think that's always the case. And what helped erode that was the First World War. It's when you had officers having to live with the people in the trenches that they were commanding. I think that does help. I mean, a war's great for so many things, but social, class breakdown,
Social
absolutely wonderful.
changes. Raw.
Oh, it's so social. I mean, war's great for medicine improvements. It's great for sort of welfare, caring for each other. It takes violence for, to make people in power see that things matter, which is just so sad. Um, but yeah, so I would put the suffragette movement down to a whole range of factors. I mean, I think the people are a big factor, but it's the internationalization of Britain and the fact that you have, because you have to remember, 4 centuries, Britain was this tiny little island doing nothing. I mean, compared to like other countries, I mean, even like if you look at, like 17th century India compared to 17th century Britain. Okay, okay, admittedly, we're starting to, build our little empire, but the Mughal Empire was massive, beautiful architecture, so much rules. They had rockets and elephants that they were fighting with, and Britain had like armies of like 500 men. I mean, come on, it's not. We were a little backwater that got incredibly lucky. One that the Spanish kings were so inbred that they couldn't carry on their dynasties, and also that the land that we captured, stole, all of that sort of thing, was profitable. Which the Dutch had a bit more difficulty finding the profitable stuff. So it's kind of it's just horrible. But anyway, hey, it's where we are. It's why we do what we do. It's great. It's history, and it's so interesting to sort of try and put yourself in those positions because particularly because I wrote The Unstoppable Letty Peg. This is a book for kids. And as a kid, I didn't care about suffragettes. One, because I thought they looked stupid, because they did. Big hats, silly, like, medal, stupid skirts. I mean, oh, I didn't want to look like that. I didn't care. They starved themselves, something I can understand as a kid. One got hit by a horse, and they made signs saying that's for women. They were rubbish. And then, as an adult, when I found out that they beat up police officers, I was just like, and it blew up buildings, and you're like, what on earth, why don't we hear about this? And in order to sort of make it a personal thing, because why would a kid care? Well, I'll make her mum a suffragette and I'll make her dad a police officer. Let's see what happens. And of course, Black Friday is one of the first scenes in the book, so you got that whole sort of thing happening to her in her head as well as her home. So she becomes the center of the little universe just there. But it is a fascinating thing, and trying to put yourself in the mindset of the people back then, just trying to sort of think, oh, that's what they would have thought. Okay, okay.
Was there, yeah,
And
because last
yeah,
time we talked, you were talking about how piracy and the democratic system that they had
yeah.
and interactions with the indigenous tribes here in America helped inspire American democracy.
I think
And
so, yeah.
the how funny it was when you were reading Christopher Columbus's writing. He goes, "Oh, these are God's people," and then suddenly he's
Let's
like, "But they would make the
enslave them.
perfect slaves."
Yeah.
It's weird, irrational behavior because I keep trying to put myself in the shoes of our ancestors, and even though I mean, in writing, we have certain texts where, like, the concept of being able to say, um, there's a season, there's a seasonal change, is completely out of the picture. They just say in X number of days, the weather's going to shift. The fact that there are these, at certain times in human history, there's like certain things that just don't cross people's minds. Um,
I think a lot of it has to do with the sort of soup you're in, and you can't see the soup you're in. This is why, I'm so grateful when I write my books that we get a sensitivity reader, because I'm sure there are people of color here listening who are just going, "Ah!" that was a bit because we're in the soup of racism, we're in the soup of sexism. It's just where we are, and I try and do my best to recognize that, but often it has to be pointed out how I'm being an idiot, and I'm grateful for that. So please do, if I've said something absolutely terrible, please say, because otherwise I will never learn. But I think if you look back at how, I just don't think there's enough death. Well, there was just so much death. 1 in 3 kids dying. You know, most people die until like the 20th century. Most people die before the age of 5. It's just like, what? It's just like, what? Really? I mean, there's a huge amount of death. There's a huge amount of suffering, and there's this sort of understanding that that's normal and it's not your responsibility to do anything about it. And at the same time, you have disease and you have environment. Lead poisoning affects your empathy in the brain. Drinking whilst pregnant affects people's empathy. Your brain will not develop in the same way as a healthy brain will. You won't have that ability to connect with other people on an emotional level. I mean, when you read about people going to public torture and public hangings and buying food, when you get people in the French Revolution watching their friends be executed and writing happy notes about what happened in their diaries, saying, "Oh, and I didn't like the dress she was wearing," you're just like, "What on earth? How can you not want to vomit?" Seeing this, and it is there is a sort of disconnect, I think, and it might be a physical disconnect just with the booze because there isn't safe, clean drinking water. So Europeans, in particular, drink, and that's how you stop yourself being poisoned, is you drink alcohol. And if you're drinking small beer from the age of 3, you're not going to be entirely, and your mother's, been pregnant, been drinking alcohol quite happily because she doesn't know that it's bad for you. It's going to affect how you are later able to think and connect with people, just physically, scientifically, that is an issue. And then things like lead pipes. We know that lead is really bad for the brain development. So I do sort of, and but saying that, there's also, it's just, people are pretty horrible if they're given leeway. And I think that's true of us too. We are pretty horrible. We just need to, there are things we do not think about. We do not think about how all our minerals are mined. We do not think about how everything that wearing is being made. We just choose not to. And that's because we don't think about the meat we eat and what's happening every time we do that. And I wear cheap clothes, I have electronics, and I eat meat. So it's not like I'm saying, and I've thought about it, I'm better than you. No, I've thought about it, thought I don't want to think about that, and I carried on. And that's a failing of me. But that's what they were doing. And we need to be a bit forgiving of them because of the soup they were in. That is my final thought on that point. But it's something that you grapple with history, but you've got to have empathy for the people of the past as well as just people now, I think.
Yeah, try to just understand and learn how you can be better ish.
I
Pick
mean,
and
yeah,
choose
I
your
mean, you could
battles.
try.
Try.
You can try and be better, but you're not going to be. There's going to be things which you're just going to not think about. You're just not. Don't put that. It's the one beautiful thing about religion, which I'm an atheist, and I do find it. I read people like Hitchens and Dawkins, and they sort of say that it's a terrible thing. They say you're born sinners and commanded to be well. Well, really, are you? I think you're born sinners and commanded to ask for forgiveness, and I think that's kind of true in history as well. We're going to muck up. We've just got to hope that future generations forgive us for it, because we all will, and that's kind of, and I'm saying that as an atheist, by the way. So,
Say that more as a
yeah,
person than an atheist. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But it is that, you have to, understand that you're not going to get everything right.
Yeah.
Trying is good.
Yeah, and I think I mean that's kind of an interesting, speaking of religion, that's always an interesting concept in religion, funny enough, is like, well, learn from your mistakes and forgive and move on. And
Well, I
maybe
don't think it's even learn for your mistakes. It's like stop making them if you can, and if you can't, ask for forgiveness. I think that's
that's
yeah, it's a thing. But anyway, so I've witted on way too long for you again. So
Hey,
apologies for
no worries. It
that.
makes it makes great content and I always enjoy it. So
Oh, good. Thank you. Well, we will talk about, like, I don't know, women flying Spitfires at some point or something like that. That'll be good.